By the time I was 10 years old, I knew that I was going to become a doctor. And some of you might ask, was my mom or my dad a doctor? No. Did I have a relative who had some illness and a doctor saved their life? No. I wish I had one of those very sensible reasons, but the reality is that I'm Indian. That's my only excuse. It's kind of what we do. Usually I look around the crowd and I look for the other Indians nodding, but I don't see any this morning. They were probably all at the hospital. But while I knew that I was going to become a doctor, I did not know that I was going to work in local government. And why? Because no 10-year-old anywhere ever has said, when I grow up, I want to work for the government, right? But as I grew up and I was exposed to, what is it that the government actually does and who does it serve and how might the power of government be harnessed for good, I was intrigued. And at some point, I was actually really blown away by President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he affirms that the Union soldiers didn't die on that battlefield in vain, but they died so that government of the people, by the people, for the people would not perish. And it was that vision of government of the people, by the people, for the people, that captivated my imagination about government. And I've tried really hard to lead our organization to embrace that and to think about what does that mean. And clearly, we have not figured it out. We get it wrong more than we get it right. I could look around the health department and see 20 different examples of initiatives where we have not done the slow, hard work of listening to resident voices or walking alongside communities. But there are a handful of examples where it actually does work. And when it works the way it ought to work, it's magical what can happen. So about 7 years ago, our mayor of the city of Richmond assembled a panel of experts to assemble a group of food policy recommendations that the city would adopt. And I air quote experts because I was actually one of those people who was on that commission. And at the time, my knowledge of food policy and food access would not be confused with expertise at any table. But thankfully, there were many people in that group who did know what they were talking about. And so at the end of the process, after months and months of just research and discussion, we came out with a pretty meaningful document, really good local data, and a summary of policy recommendations that were really based in best practice from across the country. So the report came out, and it came time to figure out, how do we actually do this? How are we going to implement the policies and practices that came out of this report? And we said, well, maybe we should actually engage the community. We're going to need their buy-in and their involvement to do some of this well. We should probably talk to people who have experienced food insecurity. And so we started a process where we would host all kinds of meetings. We would do community conversations. We would do focus groups. We would provide dinner, because that's the way that you get people to come to stuff, right? Wrong. We realized at the end of several weeks that, and a bunch of different meetings, that the grand total of community residents, real community residents who had real lived experience with food insecurity, was 5. All of the people who had been coming to our meetings were like members of government or nonprofits who, ironically, were coming so that they could hear the voice of the community. And so we had to reflect on that failure and wonder, what did we do wrong? What could we have done differently? And how should this work? And I think, we reflected on this reality that, many of our neighborhood residents just didn't trust government, right? For lots of varied reasons, for lots of complex reasons. Many people just don't feel like government interventions are going to fix things. And in fact, they often feel like the opposite, that they're actually going to break things. And so, it really set us on a course. Our health department had been on this journey about, what would it look like for us to be the type of government institution that actually has authentic relationships with residents of the communities that we exist to serve. And I think it was this posture and to some degree this exploration that allowed an interesting provocation from some resident leaders of our community. And the provocation was, why don't you look to fund a different kind of community effort? And in essence, what they were saying, stop trying to lead this thing badly, and instead support communities that have the wherewithal to actually do this. And so out of that was born the Food Justice Alliance. And the Food Justice Alliance was a gathering of low to moderate income individuals of color who had either experienced food insecurity or had worked in the space, and really just had incredible passion to solve these issues. And so we did just that. The Food Justice Alliance took off. They framed the issues, they asked the questions, they determined what trainings and what initiatives they would pursue. They drove the agendas of meetings, and we really just hung in the background. We made photocopies. We helped with graphic design support. We helped facilitate meeting space or took meeting minutes if we were asked to. We helped make connections to people who were part of the government or philanthropic or nonprofit sector that might actually help advance the work. We provided access to research and other resources. And at the end of all of this, amazing things happened. The Food Justice Alliance, the leadership that they provided, the leaders that they were lifting up in the community were doing incredible, incredible work. And in a short time, they accomplished a ton. They started community gardens. They launched a messaging campaign around nutrition that's going to be in 17 public schools in Richmond this year, and really anchored around health equity and racial equity. They established something called Feed the Culture, which was setting the city's food policy priorities with way more resident engagement and buy-in than we ever dreamed of having. And what was interesting is that a lot of those programs and policies weren't so different than what the health department was trying to do, but the content, right, the language and the imagery and the messaging, and maybe more importantly, the process of how the Food Justice Alliance sought to affirm and uphold the expertise that exists in communities was vastly different. And what it did was it gave communities agency and ownership over some of these issues in ways that we just couldn't do. And it allowed them to unravel the narrative that communities might need somebody from the outside to come in and fix things that the community can't. And instead, it honored the expertise that existed in those communities and started to rewrite a narrative that communities can heal themselves and should. So this experience and the success of working with the Food Justice Alliance has really forced me to look across our organization and to say, what if? What if in all of our programs, we were supporting community to be able to drive the conversation, to ask questions, to shape the solutions themselves? I fully admit that I have been guilty of falling prey to the idea that community can't solve it by themselves, of thinking that the genius and the creativity that I really believe exists in every individual has been stamped out by poverty or by some other systemic oppression. I've fallen prey to that. But what if the issue is that these brilliant, creative people have been denied access to the supports that could help them enact change in their own communities? And what if the role of government is to provide those resources and unleash communities to create their own solutions of the people, by the people, for the people? That's the kind of government I want to be a part of. I hope that resonates with some of you. And I hope that maybe just one day there's some 10-year-old out there who says, when I grow up, I want to work for the government too. Thank you.
Thank you.